you can download the code and the site, and there's all these sort of documentation. I'm going to work from the Word document script that I made, because when I don't, I go off track. So I'm going to follow what's on there. Just to say, I'm just like you. I'm just a developer, that's learning all of this. And in some ways, this is a show and tell. I've spoken at some Word camps and given workshops about the REST API. And when we get to the end, we'll see the real power of the REST API, where we can make what we can call custom HTML elements and deploy WordPress anywhere on the internet in HTML, in React frameworks, etc. That's my passion. So I'll start the presentation. Do put in questions, and if there's anything unclear, let me know, because I'm doing this talk at WordCamp Ohio, Kent, Ohio, next Sunday. So this will be a useful dry run for me. So you've got all the code examples, and I'll be working from the code in VS Code. If you don't know me, I started out in 1979 with a little Jupiter Ace, and in fact, this was my computer at school, paper tape, cut and paste was cut and paste. I live in Brighton and not far from Pragmatic, so you can see that there. Little bit about me in the past. I've been in and out of IT. I like doing volunteer coaching at Code Bar, just being present when somebody else is coding and helping them solve their own problems. I consider myself still a student. This is your workshop, so feel free to ask questions and point me in the right directions. But from the sample app, we're going to be basically understanding what the REST API is. We'll look at Ajax and JSON in WordPress. We're going to look at how we can create our own custom endpoints and understand what endpoints are. We'll use them for GET and POST requests. And the idea for the REST API is pages that don't need to be refreshed, meaning they're quicker, meaning we can create single page applications and make it more of an interactive page for the user, which is a key feature of JavaScript, rather than doing client server. And when we send forms, we will look at how we wire up WordPress's nonce, which is just a token to say that actually it came from the page in WordPress, rather than what they call cross-site resource forgery, where basically somebody sends you to one of their sites but can take your cookies to the server. I know a little bit about it, but not much. But basically, this is the way, and we're going to see this nonce in operation at the very end. And because we're working with the REST API, we'll see how we can even go to decoupled WordPress using decoupled authentication. That should actually say decoupled WordPress. So I just wanted to clear some terms so we're all on the same page. API is application programming interface, just one bit of software talking to another. REST, this was developed in year 2000 by Roy Fielding. At that time, it was what was called the Single Object Access Protocol. He spoke to 500 developers and think what would make it easier. And he came up with some principles. It's not a protocol. And if you look at the actual thesis, there's only like 2, 3, 4 pages on it. And actually, HTTP by its nature is very RESTful, meaning that you don't need to know client and server, don't need to know each other. You just give it a URL link and you can go from there. The term endpoint is the verb get or post and a URL, meaning that the same URL can have many endpoints. And this, we'll look in a bit, is the hello world of the REST API. And you can do a get or a post or a delete. I just work with get and post because it saves a lot of cause issues and different things like that. So like I would just send a post with action equals delete if I wanted to do some deletion. Ajax, asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Out of respect to XML, they've kept it. It should be Ajax for JSON at the end. And it enables us to read data from a web server without reloading the page, update a web page, etc. There are many libraries like jQuery Access. I use the Fetch API. It's native to the browser. It's built into the modern browsers. And when we do things like progressive web apps, offline access, we can only use the fetch API, not these. So I just stick with fetch. And I'm sure if we're not familiar with hooks, just a place in the code where we can attach our own bit of code. And we'll look at that now. So I've gone through the site setup. Just to show you what I do is I tend to use functions files in this folder called MU plugins, must use plugins, effectively plugins, but they don't appear on the dashboard, so they can't be turned on or off. They're just pure functions files. And if we look at an example one here, you can see it's just function files in there. And the MU plugins has a number of REST APIs, and I'll go through them. Here we have our different pages, which, as you know, if we create a page called nonce, page-nonce will go there if we've got our permalinks all set up. So going through, let's have a look at the site and see what we're going to build today. We're in home. I'm going to go to Ajax. And it's a little bit slow with Zoom going from page to page. And this is called page-ajax here. And all we really need to think to see is I'm doing the sort of standard JavaScript, clicking a button, loading in some data. And I'm going to explain the fetch URL and how all that works. But just to show what we can do, if we go to load posts, I'm going to the so-called hello world. This is the hello world of the REST API. And I'm just spitting out the ID and the title. If I go to the dev console, F12, bit lovely. And I have another one here that I'm going to a MySQL table just to show that I can load custom data too. And the script for that file is in the resource pack. So if I look in here, we can see we get a lot of different responses, and I'm going to go through that. If we want to do search with Ajax, by default, I've just stored this input field with JSON. If we click, I'm getting some back. I get a lot of data back, but I'm just printing out the ID and the title. And I'll go into this later. We can post data, and the very first kind of form of post is just a simple form. And we'll explain the REST API, but the REST API can send back an invalid message. Now, you won't see that, but I'm just printing it out. I'll explain how we get around that. But if I just type in some data here, I'm just spitting out what's coming back in here. That was successful. It was a post. I've customized this message, and I'll explain that. If I go to the home, we will see now that we've added a new post. There it is. And now I'll come into the notes. Now, if we go to something which is more secure, that wasn't a secure form because the server doesn't know that it actually came from me, a WordPress site. So this is the end goal of our little workshop. We're going to create a form with a nonce. A nonce is a number used once. It's just a token that isn't really stored anywhere that you can find in WordPress. It's more like a server variable. There's a very good article here about it, but I'm going to do a test post so that you can see what happens. If I send it, I'm sending back my own custom message. Notice how we have form nonce. This is the unique key. I've also sent back all the headers that were sent, and notice that here is a header called WP nonce. So what we're going to learn is how do we create all these endpoints? How do we process JSON? And I'm going to walk you through the code. Is everyone happy with that demonstration? Yep, good. I've looked at the little chat. I'll slow down a little bit. Okay. What I'd like to do now is explain the fetch API and what it produces. And I'm going to just be in VS Code. And if we come here, I've linked on the document some very good videos about fetch and promises. You don't need to really understand these to use it. When I started, I just used code snippets. So let's open this up. If I click on that, pardon me, we're going to get, this is the hello world, and this is going to give us some JSON data. Now, if you see, this is probably what you get. I get a nice format because I've got a JS formatter code, but you can also use something like JSON Editor Online to copy and paste it all in here, and it will print it out in a nicer format. So we get a lot of data back. And while this is JSON data, we can see that actually it looks a bit like an associative array, an array within arrays. And this is the standard default WordPress REST API. It's the hello world, this. I'd like to just go to the fetch page. And what I'm doing is I'm going to that link, I'm fetching it, and these are sort of next. If you've done jQuery, it's like the done finally error of jQuery Ajax. It's saying go fetch the data. Once you've got it back, because there's a time involved, because there's time going to the server and coming back, it's what's called asynchronous JavaScript. When it comes back, the first thing I'm going to do is print out what I get back. So if I go to, pardon me, open with live server, F12, I click on that. If you notice, what I get back in that very first console log is this, and there's no real text. If I click on this, it says it's a readable stream. That is why I have to convert it to JSON here. That's just the way. And when you once worked with jQuery, jQuery will do that automatically for you. In the fetch, we either change it to text or JSON, or if it's an image, to blob. But the standard code is to response.json. So if we do that, we then get an array of posts. And if we click on that, open up, we can suddenly see we get all this information that we saw before. So when we've got that back, the return means we go back down the chain. You've just seen this response.json, post the data array. I'm consoling log the number of things. We can see that all here. When we go into one, we have a number of different fields. And what I've done here is I picked the ID field and I picked the title, but the title has another kind of array in it, and it's rendered testy post. So that's how we work through. So if we look at the code, when we're coming down here, I'm just looping through it, through that data array, and spitting out the array, the .id or the .title rendered. And if I wanted something different, I would just use a different field here. In JavaScript, we can use the dot notation, or we could also use square bracket -id, but in JavaScript, they tend to prefer using the dot notation wherever possible. One has to use a square bracket if there's spaces in here. So with any luck, that should still work. Yep, that's fine. Oh, that's just a fav icon. So is that fairly clear what the JSON data is? It's really all the data in JSON format, which basically is like a long associative array. And this gives you the latest 10 posts endpoint. Okay. Now that's how the fetch works. And this is really a code snippet that we'll see time and time again. Fetch, return the response.json, and basically then just loop through it as we wish, or one individual item. And all I'm doing here is where we saw, I'm just getting all of that information and putting it into a div element at the top, main con here. So refresh. And if you notice, we didn't have to resend the page. It was done automatically. Seems a bit slow, but that's because it's on Zoom. Now, we can amend the custom endpoints. So, for example, when we come here, if you notice, I have a field called author name Craig. Now, that's not really in the API. I've made this one up. I've added a field. And the way I've done that is if we come into here and go to rest.custom, this is in our must use plugins folder. This is here. We can create a function. I've made this up, add author name to posts. I'm registering this field against the posts type, custom post type posts as opposed to pages. This is the field I'm creating, and I'm using a callback function that goes to WordPress and gets the author and supplies that back. That's my function. To add it to the REST API, I need to hook into it with add action, REST API underscore init, and add that function name. So that's how when we have endpoints, we can customize them as we wish. So if we go to the Word document that I prepared, there are many different REST APIs. And what I'd like, if we open up JSON Editor Online up here, we can actually see them, because if we come here, this up to there is the WP JSON object in WordPress. If I take that and now put it in here and do return, we will get back JSON data. I'm going to copy this and paste that into JSON Editor Online, which is what I did here. And if you notice, there's this thing called, if I copy it across code or tree, if we look at it, we can see namespaces. Because when we're in this link here, this is the JSON, this is the WP JSON, the REST API. This WP stroke V2 is a namespace. It doesn't need to be 2 items, but for versioning, you have your namespace WPT/V2, could be V3 the next time, and here is our endpoint post. So if we look at that here, we can see all the different namespaces, and there's WP stroke V2. These are mine that I've added. And if we look in here, we can see all the routes that are available. And that's better displayed in the Word document. But there are many different types. We can reduce the number of fields to just show those that we want. These are all different examples of fields that you can use. I think I've got these linked wrong because they use a different server, even though this name goes to the right place. So you might need to copy and paste that. But you can see all the different possible routes that we have. If you notice here, we have my own version. And so what I've done here is I've created my own endpoint, and we'll have a look at how that's done. But if I come here, it comes back with these, which we saw on that page when we loaded in my custom table. So when we're in here, delete that. If we look at this and load my SQL, it's my custom little table, all of these data was actually here. So the REST API this is the equivalent of WP-admin. It's the place that holds all of these. This is the root, the custom root. It could just be one word, but it's two to have version numbers in case you change it, you don't break previous. It's just the custom and the way it's done. This is my root. So let's have a look at this root district. We go into REST-custom. We can see that we have a new root that we've registered. I'm calling it WordCamp/v2. Districts, that's the last bit. This is the namespace. This is the endpoint. It's a get type, and the callback is this function here, get districts. So if we look at the function, that's straightforward WordPress. I'm accessing the table, bringing back the data, and the code here is to make it into an associative array, which I can then send back as JSON data using this little code snippet. So we won't go into detail about transforming an associative array into JSON data, but here is the formula. We're creating all of these different items and putting it into a JSON data array, reset the query, and then send back the response. And that's how we can see this. So that's the way we can make endpoints. I have a few others which you can see and play around with in the code. I'm making latest posts, and this is how you can attach a category ID. If I come up here and look at this and go to latest post, category 4, you will see that I'm getting JSON data back that I've customized in my own way of all the data that I wanted to. I can filter out data on the server side when I make my routes. So when we come back here now, we've seen how we can, based on an endpoint, this is the standard one, the hello world, we can bring back without refreshing the page, the JSON data, and we've seen it coming back in the dev tool. One useful one might be a search. So if I click on here, it's going to search. If I change the query, and of course, once you're here with your JavaScript, you could do all sorts of different things. You can display more data, a link, etc. So what we've seen now is the get functionality. And we've seen that in Ajax. When we've come here, I'm loading the data. This is just a server variable to end. We've done the districts, which we saw, and we've also seen the posts. And you can see it's the same old code snippet time and time again. And sometimes I struggle with getting the right element out of the JSON data. It's trial and error or the iterative process and displaying it down. And it took me a while to be comfortable to make them up myself. But basically, you can just use these code snippets. You can put them into a function to refactor them. But that is how we can now get this type of functionality without refreshing the page, unless we're going to a new page. And this is what's called the single page application. We could have more buttons, and we could have just one page on our WordPress site and have it purely in JavaScript. You can use jQuery library. I've even used a Vue CDN on a PHP page, so I could run a Vue app in a WordPress site. That's possible too. That's just using a JavaScript library and using its functionality that once it's on that page, as we've seen here in the code, we now enter JavaScript land here, and we can just run single page apps, a React.js if we wanted to, whatever one wants to do. So we've covered get. Now we need to go to post. How do we send data? Standard form here, we saw an example of that. Let's jump to the code, because if I don't put the right stuff, I get this back. Now that's just me sending back what the response was. If we go to function F12, I'm just displaying back what the message was back from the server, which was all of this stuff here. I'm just displaying it for demo purposes. Let's go to page-post. A standard form, a click handler in JavaScript, just getting the values. And what I'm doing here is I'm using the form data object to send it, because when it gets to the PHP server, it will see that as a post object and can then do server-post to get the items. So what I'm sending is the content, the title. If I want to send any hidden fields, we can do that here. And what I've done up here, I've just created a random number as like a token. In this particular instance, we can send hidden data. And now when I'm doing my fetch request, same as before with the URL, I'm going to my custom route, which we'll look at shortly. This time method is post, and I've got to send the body data. For those that have worked with JavaScript and send JSON data, you would send back your content type. But because I'm sending a form data back, I don't need to do that. It's as if I'm just sending a form to PHP to WordPress. And this time when I get the response back, because I'm sending back a custom message, which we'll have a look at, I'm doing response.text so that it converts that stream again into text, which I can then just display. So that's it. That's how we do a form. Let's have a look how we process it on the server side. Once again, we're going to add something to the REST API. We're going to create a route, OWTV1. I have a link to a great set of videos on YouTube that really taught me how to do this. There's not much information about this detail, and the links in the document, you'll be able to see where I got all this information from. This time we're doing a post request, and this is just, I can either use post or I can use a REST server class. And just to show you where we can get that, if I come here, talks, in the documentation, this is where we can see that it's just a static function to give a set of values. You can use either post or you can use get. You don't have to use constant readable equals get. That's all that's doing there. So we need to, as we've done before, when we create a route, tell it what function we're going to use. I'm calling it the REST O2 route. And remember, we saw that here. I've sent back, I didn't send back the data. That's next time. If I type in something here and do a good form, success, I've put back what the route is, and I'll show you where I've got that from, but I'm saying status is success. I can then interact with the data to give a message to the user that everything was fine, maybe hide the form if I'm in JavaScript. You can see the text, you can see the hidden field. So we're going to look at how I did that. Well, firstly, when we saw the error message, the reason we got that original error message back was that I made this required, the title variable that was posted across as required, and I put a validate callback. You don't need to do this. You can do it later as when we see it, but all the different fields that I sent across, I've actually made them required. I don't need to do this because when I come to the actual function itself, I can do the server, I can do the request method. If it's of a type, I can get all the parameters. This is what they call boilerplate WordPress code. I can get all the different form elements. I can sanitize them. I'm creating an array. I then insert the post. And this is where I send my custom message back with whatever I want to send back. It could just be this, or it could be more. If I sent nothing across, this error message comes back here. If we come back here, if we refresh the page, this bit here, if it's violated, gives us this message back, and it's telling us they're invalid parameters. I don't need to do that, but it's in here for inclusivity. What really happens is I'm processing the form of getting all the parameters that were sent across, the title, the content, I had a hidden field, sanitizing, and then now just doing WordPress PHP. And I can send back any sort of message I want, so that on the client side, when I get it, based on this, I can now do, if we go into page.post, when it comes back, I could then I could look at the text and say, if it says failure, do something. But that's the wiring between a post request and a REST endpoint in REST-post. What can happen though is somebody could post here by kind of on another tab, sending us a link, sending that URL across and taking all our cookies across. Because what happens when we do a post request, when we go to a particular endpoint, to a particular server, all the cookies for that domain are sent with it. So somebody could trick that server into thinking that it came from this page. There's nothing to stop somebody hacking this page and sending data to our server. So we need something to identify that this really is coming from our WordPress site and nowhere else. So we move into the WordPress nonce. And on this little article here, I've got some standard data. We create a nonce by giving it a name. And here's the value. And we can basically verify the nonce from what's been sent to what was stored when we created the page on the server to see if it's true. Some articles here that go into greater depth. And we'll see an example of this, which will make it clearer. So if we go to page nonce, to the posting, very similar to the form we've just seen. I'm using session tokens because I want to send a little bit more data out. But if we come down here, and then there's some useful links to all of this, what I'm doing now is creating with WP Create a nonce, this value here. Now, this value has to be called this. This is an action. I've tried it with different names, and if you're logged in, it won't work. So what the documentation says, and here is the link, is that when we're using this REST API for form processing and using a nonce, we must use, and it's here, it's creating the XWP nonce header. We must use WP REST as the action. And if we send form data, it must use this parameter. And we're going to see this data when we fill in this form. So the difference now is I'm sending across that nonce. I've created the value. I've created the nonce here value. I'm sending across as a sort of hidden field. I'm sending all the data. You can either get that nonce from the headers or from the body information. This is just used. We're going to see what the headers are. And I'm just showing this for completeness and doing exactly the same as before. So let's fill that form and see what happens. We're coming here. Notice again, if I violate those parameters initial, I get the custom REST API message. That's built in. I didn't make this. That's just what gets sent back. But if I type in some fields now and send the form, my custom message that I've created, I'm saying it's success. I'm just displaying this, but I received my own little token. I received the form nonce, and notice how it's telling me it's less than 12 hours old, and I'll explain that. And if you notice here, the header nonce and all headers, you can see that if we just want to use headers, this is where the nonce will be kept. So we've got different ways of getting the information, either through headers or by sending it as a hidden field in the form. So let's look at the code. It's basically the same as the post. This is all the same, except this time I'm adding an extra field. I don't need to have required because it's later on that I check, but that's how one might do it if one's using these REST APIs in a slightly different way. Again, this is using REST 03 root. And if we notice in here, if we go to page nonce, we will see that that is the root I'm using. WP-JSON, my own custom namespace, and REST 03. We come back here. We've added that as a root up top here, REST 03, namespace, REST 03. Come back here, same again, everything's roughly the same. I'm now getting that nonce value. And when I come here, I'm verifying it between what was sent and what's been stored as the server when we created this on the page form. And it has to be this. If we use different names, it won't work when you're logged in. It does work when you're logged out, but if you're logged in, it doesn't seem to work. So following the documentation, these are the names we must use. And what's coming back is when it verifies, it comes back with either nonce has failed, it's less than 12 hours old, or it's between 12 and 24 hours, and a default message. So having verified, if it's either 1 or 2, I go ahead and do what I need to do. And this, you can see where I've sent back all that debug information. Otherwise, I'm sending back a message failure. Now, when it's 24 hours, there's an article that goes, it starts at midnight, and it's got to be, there's what's called a WordPress tick function. That is a 12-hour block. You can't be more than 2 blocks away. There's an article on this page that really explains it better here, and it has the diagram. In fact, why don't we just open it up, because I think the actual diagram will show us quite clearly what this means. It's kind of 2 12-hour periods it can be valid for. If you started it late in the very first period, you'd only get about 13 or 14 hours. So if we look back down here at the diagram, we can see that basically when you're in this period here, it's only valid for these 2 12-hour periods. If we start later in the day, so it becomes invalid. That's how we get the 12-hour valid for 12 hours or valid for less than 24 hours. It's not a 24 hours per se, it's these different time periods. Read this article, it explains it better than I can do it now. So we've now really seen all examples of using the REST API. We've seen the get function, we've seen using different search facility, we've posted insecurely, and we've now posted securely with this nonce. Here is the nonce. In this particular example, I'm logged out, so it's telling me my session ID doesn't exist. I just changed this back to logged out. I can send over hidden fields, and it says valid, nonce is less than 12 hours old. If it's more than 24 hours old, or should we say 2 time periods, then it would be invalid. And when we sent across all the headers, we saw that we could get the nonce that way. And we could also use more security checks by looking at some of the things that have been sent through to verify that it really did come from our WordPress page. What I'd like to do now is just give a space for people to make some comments or questions, because I've not been able to see people. Is there anything that needs to be addressed? If we take a little pause, that's about 25 minutes. I'm open for any questions that might be needed or comments. Hello, John, Paul.
Oh, hi.
You
yeah,
came.
I mean, the question I suppose I've got is, at the risk of sounding stupid, is where has anyone seen this being applied in anger to real great effect?
Okay, that's a great question. Because actually this, I mean, well, I don't know. I tell you what I do. And this is, I was going to show you later. But with the REST API, what I would like to do is go to here and come to the site. I think when you come here, if we look at this, I've got this en route that I'm using, 106, change post to 109. I'm displaying a whole set of categories or the posts. I've got a little top button here. I've got a nav bar. If we wanted to do lazy loading, if we go into F12, what we can do is load in the post dynamically and actually speed up the site. Now, when we're in here, if I go to the network tab, I've disabled cache, by the way, just up here. If I refresh the page, we can see that coming through. If I now click load components, suddenly now what we're doing was we're loading in all the script files and all the data on demand. And I can show you. Sorry? Sorry?
I didn't say anything.
Oh, okay. So that's how, look, what I'd like to do is I'm going to close that off. If we go into, that was dynamic. If we go into a blog post, where we can use it is when we're loading all of this. That's got the new things. What I could do is if I go function F12, first you remember this is very fast. And the reason this is very fast is this is stored in JavaScript objects. So function F12, so this is, if we come into that, if we go into network, and I'm going to go offline. We're now working offline, simply because by storing it in the JavaScript object, it's already in memory. So it's instant, but it's offline. I'm going to go online here. Where we can use the WordPress is if, for example, if we wanted to do decoupled WordPress, one of the main issues is authentication. So I've got a component here that, firstly, remember, the site is 49 plus. That's where I'm logged in. I'm on WP-HTML. If I go here and do let's log in here, 49plus.co. I come here and log in, I'm just giving back a JSON web token that I've stored on the server and brought back. There's a whole load of information I do get back, but I'm just choosing to show the JSON web token. So if you wanted to kind of do decoupled WordPress, the REST API is how we use it, because we're not in a PHP ecosystem. We can be on a totally different domain or subdomain and now basically work through. You can see here that there's a lot more information that comes back. I've just decided just to do the JSON web token. How we can also use it is lazy loading, because what we can do is actually do it when it crosses the threshold. So I'm going to close this down. And for example, if I scroll down, because it's all JavaScript, if you notice, it's going to come into view with the red line. You see a post. God, that's it. This would normally be below the fold, but just for demonstration purposes. And if we look to the network tag, these are loaded dynamically. So if we want to create faster pages and load in posts only when they're in view, a bit like Google accelerated mobile pages, that's how the REST API becomes very effective.
I see.
And finally, what I like to do is show, well, not finally, second to last, is progressive web app. What I did on the home page is if I go into F12, what I've done on this page is when I was on home, I've loaded in the browser's own IndexedDB all the posts. So when this comes up into F12, if we come in here, if I go into application tab, if I look in IndexedDB, have you noticed I've loaded all the categories? I've got 5 or 6 categories.
Yeah.
All of the data is in here. So that's going to be very fast. But what I can do is if I go to network, go offline now, I now have a single page app that works while offline because the whole WordPress site is literally stored in here.
Mm.
Now, how WordPress, and I've spoken quite a bit about the proverbial WordPress components. If we look at this, if you notice, we're on HTML.
Mm.
And if I do a Control U, if you notice, when we look at the source code, let me do a better page. We go into home. This is how we can make what I call HTML plugins. So if I go Control U, if we look at the source code, the way this page is written is, can you see these? This is how I loaded the database, just with the custom HTML tag.
Yeah.
So basically what we can do is using web components, which is custom HTML tags, with JavaScript and REST API, we can deploy these components anywhere. And rather than somebody having to manipulate the JSON data, because they may not be developers, you can say, would you like a copy of our blog on your site? Would you like to see our products? So when we come back here, for example, we go to category. I do Control U. I'm on HTML. This has nothing to do with WordPress. That's it. That's the page. And so it's now actually rewriting our WordPress just with our own custom design. They're called web components. They're just custom HTML elements with a source code. So we could now deploy this. And if we look to make it.
So it would be a bit like when, you know, I've built websites for restaurants, and with the booking system, the people doing the booking, they send me a JavaScript source URL, you know, and I just put that script into the WordPress into the widget, and then I've got the booking system on the website. So what you're saying, so I think what you showed me there was you'd created a page, and all you needed to do was show the JavaScript source code, and the whole thing comes up.
Let's open this up. Into output. Can you see I've got the post ID here? It's just a regular HTML tag, custom. If I type, that's 106. On the fly, I can do, what is it, 109. If I change it in here and do that, it's going to change the post value to 109. So what it means is we could give people just 2 lines of code and they could change it. I've lost, can you still see me and everything? Yeah. Sorry, so in a sense, when we say the REST API, that for me, between REST API and web components, means that actually WordPress can be fully 100%, because what's happening and trending in the JavaScript frameworks is rather than doing Angular, React, they're making them into web components so that all the frameworks could talk to each other on one page. And while I'm here, that was a really good question, because I really wanted to kind of show this. Is basically, this is how I kind of viewed the world. HTML with all the frameworks, and here is WordPress kind of alone. Now with web components, I can roll them into frameworks or into HTML. So if you're a WordPress agency, you can deploy your clients' content far and wide for exposure for SEO. It could be a paid service because you may have valuable content that somebody says, yeah, I would like to do it. I think you get the gist of this.
Yeah.
So that's how. So REST API is used for decoupled. I mean, and essentially, when I'm on this site here, this is a decoupled WordPress site using all the WordPress, but it's on a different domain. And now it's just the data that gets imported. So I know.
So you might not have heard the question that I asked there, Craig, when you got cut out. So what I was saying was, it sounds very much to me like, you know, if you're designing a WordPress site for a customer who's, say, a restaurant, and they've signed up to a booking system, the company that provides a booking system, you know, they send me a script that I put into a widget, and bang, I've got all their online booking functionality on the website. So am I right in saying what you're saying here is you're doing exactly the same thing, and then providing that bit of script to go to whoever it is has got a website that you want your content to be displayed on?
Exactly. And in a sense, what it is we can deploy WordPress content and functionality because we can send information. You might process a mortgage application. The example I tend to give is it might be a food supplier that would love to have recipes to promote their products. And if you've got a WordPress site that has lots of recipes, you can give them a nice little web component that can have the right kind of settings so that they can just, do a drop down box or use it rather than having this big chunk of JSON data and they've got to work through it. If they've got developers, it's no big issue. But for other people, it's basically an HTML plugin. So what I'm seeing is these are plugins that can go outside of WordPress. Because if we've got great content and great functionality, so for example, when we did the login, well, that's just sending form data and getting a response back. Now, this could be anything. This could be type in pasta to get your best 10 recipes. Or for example, when we're doing here, they may click on a function and get so many. These are all just bulk posts. These are recipes. Even this and the drop down are web components. So when we were in the PWA, for example, you might say Italian food, Indian food, Chinese food. All of these could be customized accordingly. So that's why for me, the REST API is kind of nice because my kind of view is, for me, as I'm an ex-DBA, is WordPress is fundamentally a database. So I think, why does it have to be so complex just to see hello world when it's just getting a little bit of JSON data back? And because we were told learn JavaScript deeply, and remember, with these web components, you can use them in NPHP pages. You can also use them in Gutenberg blocks rather than doing sort of Gutenberg block development. There have been a couple of people at WordCamp Europe a couple of years ago and Omaha WordCamp. They say make WordPress make web components and just plunk them into your Gutenberg block rather than having to make Gutenberg blocks. So web components are really coming to the fore. And that's JavaScript, and that enables us as WordPress developers to do things for other people because we could just create web pages that are for people on their HTML site.
Yeah.
So they're really great questions. So that's kind of for me what REST API is about.
Thank you, Craig.
Cheers. Any other questions? I mean, the code samples you'll learn as developers, it's too much to take in now. But when you play around with it, chop it, you'll be able to reproduce site here, the pages, play around with it to do different things. But yeah, it's just the single page application. Now you could put Vue.js library here and use a Vue application, make it simpler for JavaScript.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Yeah, so sorry. First of all, sorry I came a bit late to it all. Had a family commitment, so had to deal with that. But obviously, I understand there's going to be a recording of this, so I'll look back over it. My main question is, I've did a little pet project just to teach myself REST API for WordPress. But I went down a PHP route because that's mainly where I've come from. But I'm probably going to redo it all again in JavaScript. I just got a couple of, the main thing is the authorization I did was basic authorization, and then I wrote something into it that it has to be over SSL. And I'm just wondering if that is sufficiently secure if you're sending, especially like, the login data to access a remote site, if that is sufficiently secure, or if it's better to use something like tokens or the other options. Is
that on a septic? When you're in WordPress, you can just follow WordPress functions, and that nonce, for example, is the added security. Are you talking about sites that are outside the WordPress ecosystem, and you're kind of doing? Yeah.
It was basically the whole premise was when I got, and it is working. I surprised myself, it worked. It was the fact you have a single location to have all the web posts, and you then distribute out the posts to different remote sites. Obviously you need access to those sites, and that's all the image data, everything. So I'm just wondering what the best authorization process would have been.
Right. Well, I'm in the code. There's another link called auth, and if we use this email and password, this is going to a login that I've created here. That when I send it, it will authenticate me, send me back my WordPress ID and a JSON Web Token. Now, JSON Web Tokens are an industry standard for security. You either store them in local storage or in cookies. There's lots of arguments about either side. There's also JWTE, where it's encrypted and it's kind of using keys with a third party. But JSON Web Tokens, JWT, is considered the industry standard. It can easily be decoded, but it's kind of, it's more it hasn't been tampered with. So that's how you do it. That's the login for the authentication when you're outside the WordPress system. It's JSON Web Tokens, and this, I've got the code. It's in the pack that you've got to create a JSON Web Token once you've logged in. Just very quickly, if we go in here into JWT, there are certain number of functions to create it, and it just creates it and sends it back. And what it does is it takes the ID, encodes it with your secret key. It can be read. It's not secure, but what it means is if you change one character, it won't be verified or come back as being not a valid signature. So what it's doing, it's like the old days when we used to send checks. It's actually the signature and the payload are all integrated. So if somebody put an extra naught, signature wouldn't match up. That's what JWT does. It's not encryption per se. It's that nothing's been changed. What was sent hasn't been adulterated.
Right. Okay. Okay. That sounds like a good sign.
Yeah.
So good to get my teeth into.
Yeah. So JJJ, some people don't think JWT is that secure, and they say it's got to be JWTE. I don't know about security, but that's how. And if you think how when you log in with WordPress, you're sending your password and your user logins over the internet anyway. So at some point, somebody can intercept.
Yes. Yes, certainly. Okay, that's very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thanks, James.
Okay.
So what you've got in this pack, if you've got a question, ask me, but you've got the styles, you've got that JSON Web Token set of PHP functions to create. And what it does, it comes across, I create a function, I authentication, I send it back. You've got the post, or better still, the post nonce that shows you how to create the nonce to send it either in the form or in headers. You've got some examples which use the standard built-in REST APIs for loading data from scripts, search one. And also, if we look in here in REST custom, you've looked how you can add fields, for example, and this was taken from Brad Schiff, actually. I got this bit from him, how you can add fields accordingly. You can add anything back here, but if you want the proper author name, and I'm going to just talk about advanced custom fields while I remember it. You've got how you can create your own routes and then just use standard WordPress PHP to kind of send your response back. You've got these examples. And what we'll do is if we go quickly into WP-JSON, go to a link, v/v2/post, just to look at how advanced custom fields is handled. If we come down.
Yeah, I was using that in my project as well, just for a good interface. So
yeah, it makes it great. So basically, I've added advanced custom fields. You need to add the plugin ACF to REST API.
yeah.
And if we look down here, ACF, it comes up. So if I go into my dashboard, that's basically, if you don't add it, you don't get your custom, but it should come through. And I think by default now, when you make custom post type, show in REST, you used to have to set that to true in the past. It's now by default true. So all custom post types are kind of ACF. So if we come into here into plugins, that's it there. If I deactivate it and go back into posts, it should not be available. ACF, yeah, I think the ACF's gone because of that plugin. So that's how we handle, and advanced custom fields is superb because you can make, as you know, you can make your kind of template for your client and put it through. But that's how we can see it. So if you're working in the PHP work, well, to be honest, I don't know. I'm not in production. I'm a boffin. I'm just learning and wiring things. So I don't really know about these things. But I would assume if you're in WordPress itself, you might just use it for single page for quickness, or you want to kind of make it a bit more interactive. But as you can see, you can very quickly turn things into offline access or very fast access, simply because we did the loading it into IndexedDB. And that's just basically getting all the post data, connecting to IndexedDB and loading it there. Because IndexedDB is very much like your MySQL. So you can store it all locally. And then if a person's on a commuting, they're not losing contact. And as we saw in that example, when we went to the site here, you can then store literally your whole site, and then you can use the lazy loading to, when the browser's idle, to load more information. What Google does is when they hover over, in that second between hovering and clicking, they load what you need to do. So that's how you can make very fast pages. So for me, to make WordPress sites very fast, it's using this kind of model of kind of building the page as we go along. So when we're on here, as I showed you before, basically this will work offline because all the data is actually in the browser now.
Mm.
So that's why the REST API is really useful, you know. And then also there's and soon, in fact, making themes like web components, etc. You're thinking, well, maybe actually you can just have HTML themes that get a nice HTML template and just fill in the data as needed with the REST API. So without having to worry about a WordPress PHP theme, you could just do a nice design HTML theme, or you can make HTML pages for people with data.
Yeah.
So I like the idea of a back end for the office, putting in all the data. The front end could be nice HTML. That's fine.
Mm. Excellent.
So what we're planning to do, I think in a week or two's time, is actually get into progressive web apps with WordPress, of how we can do it, how we can work with service workers. A basic core. I'm giving a workshop later in the year on progressive web apps for sort of developers, not for WordPress people, but learning how we can use index-based service workers to actually make offline. A progressive web app should be called progressively enhanced. PWA is just a website with extra features that are now available in the browser and the HTML APIs. So that's why with the REST API, in fact, what I can very quickly do is if I come here, we now have, this is a WordPress site, basically PWA. We can have the add to home screen button. Can you notice how this came up as install along here? If we do the add to home screen, we can install it on the mobile as an add to home screen device. We can enable notifications. I think with this, if I go offline, all the posts will emerge. That's what we do in the PWA kind of workshop, that everything can actually work when it's offline, because it's using a service worker to cache the page so that our browser is both a web server and a database. At the moment, we've just looked at storing stuff in the database, IndexedDB, but there's also the cache API. Let's have a look at that. If we look at this page, if we look at what's going on behind the scenes now, if we go into the application tab, we will see that we've loaded in data. It's more this one here. But if we look in the cache, this is now storing all our pages. So what we've actually done here is we've really made our handheld device a local web server with the pages, the templates with the data. So you can go completely offline. And if I do go offline here, for example, go offline, I've disabled cache. I go fully offline. If I go to posts, it should kind of, I've shaded it out in grey to show I'm offline. I'm offline now, but really my site's working. And I can also send form data as well if I'm offline. I can go and send a form, and when it's back online, it will send the data out. This is the sort of PWA functionality of installing to home screen and of basically being super fast.
Good.
Craig, have you got any recommendations of best places to really learn about the PWA side?
Well, John Morgan Jones, he's organising a PWA workshop. I kind of give that a couple of hours. So if you want to come onto that, you learn how to make all of this and all the wiring and all the code. The best PWA course is on Udemy with Academind, Max Schwartzman. He does a PWA course. That's the best one. The best book is this, if you want books. But we're going to be doing a workshop on PWAs where we'll build all of this functionality that's actually for Google is probably more for Google Chrome. It's more advanced than many other browsers. If you come on that, you get all the code, learn all the ins and outs. You'll know how to. You'll walk away with a PWA that you can then chop up and redesign.
John, that's perfect timing because we are looking to do that Sunday the 7th. If anybody's interested, probably late morning or early afternoon. Which suits best on a Sunday?
I'm easy, whatever the time really.
Right.
And what you're actually getting, if we come here, I'm actually doing a PWA workshop at NDC in June. So that's my preparation. It's another one of my preparations. Basically, when we come here on Thursday, I think I'm doing it. This is the workshop you'll be getting, 10 to 11, progressive web apps. It's 2-1 hour, so it's a 2-hour workshop. We go through and we learn, and you walk away and you know how to do PW. You know, you'll understand service workers, cache API, index DB, all of that stuff.
Excellent.
Right.
Good. Well,
I think we've come to the end of our.
end of that. Do contact me because I'm happy to kind of do a bit of Zoom work with anyone that wants to know more about REST API, etc. So as I said here, be in touch if you've got questions. What I enjoy doing. Thanks for bearing with me through all of that. And as you say, you've got all the code samples and everything there that you're good to go.
Brilliant.
Right. I'd just like to say thank you, Craig. That's an
Thank you.
amount of work you've given us access to, and extremely detailed, and it's obviously seriously useful. If anybody does have any questions, please post them through the WordUp website, which isn't really advertised that much, but it's definitely on the WordUp page. And that I will post both this talk and any other questions you have. All right.
Can I ask one more quick question? Is that possible?
Sure.
Yep.
It's just a general question. Is there anything on WordUp, or if anyone's put together or know a good way or tutorial of doing WordPress plugin development that will help create a very nice interface when you're working with REST API, so you can get the success, the messages or the error messages, so you know if something's been submitted or whatever by a form or whatever inside, that you know the process is working. And I'm just trying to figure a way of building a plugin interface. And I wonder if there's anything on WordUp that covers anything like that.
Not that I'm aware of, but I guess it's worth the hunt, because
Yeah.
thought within overall WordPress development there should be some guidelines.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I've like I say, I've been using ACF, a lot, and I can work it into there. But I just wondered if there's another way I can get around it, But that's fine. That's all right.
Right. Well, thank you all.
Thanks. That's been good. And as I say, any questions, I enjoy doing this sort of stuff, so do contact me. I'm just a boffin, so basically it's not going out into production, so if I can help other developers make a living, all well and good.
Thank you very much.
All right. Ciao.
Yeah, thanks, Craig, and thanks, John.
Cheers, y'all. Bye.
Take care, bye.